Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a desert so massive and deadly that locals literally call it the place of no return. Your entire fortune is loaded onto some camels that haven't had water in 3 days. And somewhere out there in those endless dunes are bandits, hostile kingdoms, and sandstorms that can bury you alive. Welcome to the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty, where merchants either came back rich enough to buy entire villages or they never came back at all. And today we're exposing the actual survival manual that separated the success stories from the skeletons in the sand. Between the 2nd century BCE and 2nd century CE, when the Han Dynasty was running things in China, there wasn't actually a single Silk Road like you might imagine, but rather this insane network of routes that twisted and turned around the Taklamakan Desert, which just happens to be one of the most lethal environments on the planet. The Han government, being the bureaucratic powerhouse they were, put together incredibly detailed guides for anyone brave or desperate enough to make this journey. Whether you were a merchant trying to get rich, an envoy on imperial business, a Buddhist monk spreading the faith, or just some poor soul hired to keep the camels from dying. What we're about to reveal comes from actual archaeological evidence, including some pretty wild discoveries at places like the Zhuangquanji Post Station near Dunhuang, where scientists have literally analyzed 2,000-year-old poop to figure out what diseases were killing travelers. So buckle up because we're counting down the 10 most crucial survival secrets that could mean the difference between striking it rich or becoming another cautionary tale. Coming in at number 10, we've got the single most important decision of your entire journey, and it happens at a dusty oasis town called Dunhuang. See, when caravans rolled into Dunhuang after weeks of travel through the Hexi corridor, they hit what was essentially a fork in the road from hell because the Taklamakan Desert ahead of them was 600 miles of pure death that nobody in their right mind would cross directly. Your only options were to go around it, either taking the northern route through places with names like Hami, Turpan, Korla, Kucha, and Aksu, where the Tian Shan Mountains provided glacial runoff for the oases, or you could gamble on the southern route through Miran, Shurchen, Nia, Khotan, and Yarkand, following the edge of the Kunlun mountain range instead. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this wasn't just about picking the scenic route. The northern path turned into an absolute furnace during summer, with Turpan regularly hitting temperatures that would make Death Valley jealous. We're talking over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in a depression that sits below sea level, basically nature's own convection oven. Meanwhile, the southern route seemed cooler in summer, but don't let that fool you, because winter nights down there could freeze the water in your containers solid, and spring brought sandstorms so violent that entire caravans would just vanish, like they never existed. The smart money was on choosing your route based on what season you were traveling in, what kind of cargo you were hauling, and most importantly, which oasis kings you had good relationships with, because picking wrong meant your bones would be joining the countless others scattered along these ancient paths. Number 9 brings us to something that sounds boring, but was actually life or death: paperwork. And the Han Dynasty didn't play around when it came to documentation. Before you could even think about leaving Chang'an or Luoyang, you needed official travel orders complete with all the right seals. And these weren't just formalities that some lazy guard would wave through. At every checkpoint, every post station, and especially at the major passes like Yumen Pass, which they called the Jade Gate, and Yangguan, officials would go through your documents with the kind of thoroughness that would make modern TSA agents look relaxed. The system worked through these wooden slips and bamboo tallies that basically functioned as ancient passports, and we know exactly how strict this was, because archaeologists at Zhuangquanji have dug up thousands of these things, perfectly preserved in the dry desert air. Every single piece of valuable cargo needed its own contracts with stamped receipts. And God help you if you were carrying unauthorized salt or iron, because those were state monopolies, and the Han government had fought entire political battles over controlling these resources, including the famous salt and iron debate of 81 BCE, where Confucian scholars tried and failed to argue against the monopolies. Even Buddhist monks carrying religious texts, which started becoming common during the Eastern Han period, needed the right paperwork, or they'd be turned away at the border. Though by 105 CE, when Kailun perfected papermaking techniques, some lucky travelers could carry lighter paper copies of their permits, assuming the guards accepted them instead of demanding to see the traditional wooden originals. Sliding into number 8, let's talk about the math that could save your caravan or destroy it completely. understanding exactly what your Bactrian camels could handle. These two humped beasts of burden were literally your lifeline in the desert, capable of hauling between 330 to 440 pounds of cargo for the long haul, but push them even slightly beyond their limits, and you'd start losing animals to exhaustion, which meant abandoning valuable cargo in the middle of nowhere. The golden rule that every successful merchant memorized was 19 to 25 miles per day in mixed terrain, assuming you gave them proper rest, though you could squeeze out 31 miles in an emergency if you were willing to basically destroy your animals in the process. Water management became this intricate dance of calculation and hope, because while everyone knows camels can go days without water, only idiots actually counted on that ability when planning routes. Your entire journey had to revolve around confirmed water sources at oases, with backup plans for when wells ran dry or hostile rulers decided to charge extortionate prices for access. Horses were a completely different nightmare, essential for scouts and carrying urgent messages. Plus, the Han Dynasty was so obsessed with getting those superior Fergana horses they called heavenly horses that they literally went to war twice between 104 and 101 BCE just to secure breeding stock. But these animals needed constant water and would basically die if you tried to take them through the worst desert stretches, leading to the merchant saying that became universal. Camels carry profit, horses carry news, and you need both, but only camels will get you home. Number 7 is where things get genuinely disgusting, but incredibly important. Because recent archaeological studies at Xuanquanji Post Station uncovered something that rewrites what we know about ancient trade routes. Perfectly preserved 2,000-year-old parasite eggs in the latrine. Scientists found Chinese liver fluke, whipworm, roundworm, and tapeworm eggs on the actual hygiene sticks travelers used, proving that these trade routes were spreading diseases across continents way earlier than we thought. And the survival guide's obsession with hygiene suddenly makes a lot more sense. The rules were simple but absolute. Boil every drop of water, no matter how clean it looked. Never eat raw freshwater fish, especially from oasis pools, because the liver fluke would literally eat you from the inside out. Keep your hands and utensils clean even when water was precious, and stay far away from any food or water sources near latrines or where animals gathered. The desert might seem sterile with all that dry air and blazing sun, but oasis settlements were basically disease incubators, contaminated with human and animal waste that bred parasites perfectly adapted to hitching rides and human hosts. And since Han Dynasty medicine had no way to treat these infections once you got them, prevention was literally the only option that didn't end with you dying in agony somewhere between oases. Number 6 drags us into the political nightmare that was the western regions during the Han period, because unlike what you might expect, there was no unified control over these territories. Starting in 60 BCE, the Han set up something called the Protectorate of the Western Regions with headquarters at Wulai, trying to maintain order over dozens of oasis kingdoms. But the reality was that control shifted constantly between the Han, their nomadic enemies, the Xiongnu, and local kings who switched sides whenever it suited them. Places like Kucha, Khotan, Shanshan, and Kashgar were technically under Han influence, but their loyalty lasted exactly as long as Han military powers seemed stronger than whoever else was offering protection or threats. The survival guide got really specific about reading political situations, because mentioning the wrong authority at the wrong time could get you killed just as fast as running out of water. Smart merchants didn't just hire scouts to watch for bandits. They hired them to gather intelligence about which flags were flying at the next oasis, whether the local king had recently switched allegiances, and what kind of tribute or bribes would be expected. During the Eastern Han period, the legendary General Ban Chao spent almost 30 years, from 73 to 102 CE, basically beating these oasis states back into submission. But even his iron-fisted control couldn't guarantee that the king you made a deal with last year wouldn't rob you blind this year if the political winds had shifted, making every diplomatic interaction a potential life or death negotiation. Number 5 reveals why timing your journey wrong was basically signing your own death warrant, because the Silk Road had killer seasons that would destroy unprepared caravans. Summer on the northern route was beyond brutal, with Turpin becoming this natural death trap where temperatures soared so high that metal objects became untouchable, and travelers reported their sandals melting to their feet, forcing everyone to adopt night travel schedules and spend daylight hours hiding in whatever shade they could find or create. But summer heat was just one problem, because water sources that existed in spring would be bone dry by July, forcing caravans to carry extra water that slowed them down even more in the killing heat. Spring looked safer on paper, but brought its own special horror in the form of sandstorms that could last for days, especially in the Hexi corridor between March and May, where visibility would drop to absolutely nothing and the sand would get into everything: your food, your water, your eyes, your lungs, until you couldn't tell which direction you were facing. The survival guide's advice was brutally practical. The moment a sandstorm started building, you stopped moving immediately, lashed everything down as low as possible, covered every opening in your body and your supplies, and just waited it out. Because trying to push through was how entire caravans ended up wandering in circles until they died of thirst 50 feet from the trail they'd lost. Winter seemed like it might be easier until you realized that the same mountain passes that were pleasant in summer became frozen hellscapes where altitude sickness combined with hypothermia to kill travelers who'd survived everything else the road threw at them. Number 4 exposes the real economics of the Silk Road. Because while everyone knows about silk going west, the actual money was in understanding market psychology and what specific cultures desperately wanted. Sure, silk was valuable, but patterned silk with specific designs could be worth 10 times more than plain bolts. And by the 2nd century CE, when paper started becoming available, a few sheets of this miraculous new material given to the right official could open doors that mountains of gold couldn't budge. The smartest merchants diversified like crazy, carrying lacquerware boxes that wouldn't break like ceramics, high-quality iron tools that were still rare in Central Asia, and small luxury items that took up minimal space but commanded premium prices. Going the other direction, everyone dreamed about trading in those famous Fergana horses, but the reality was that most merchants couldn't afford the startup costs or manage the logistics of moving living cargo across deserts. Instead, the real profit came from Roman glass, which sounds crazy until you realize that Roman soda lime glass has been found in Han Dynasty tombs all over China, proving there was massive demand for these exotic transparent objects that Chinese craftsmen couldn't replicate. Lapis lazuli from Bactria, perfumes from even further west, and especially nephrite jade from Khotan were the trinity of westward profit, with Khotan jade being so prized by Chinese elites that controlling even a small portion of that trade could set your family up for generations. But here's the kicker that the survival guide stressed over and over. One small, high-value item that you could protect was worth more than 10 camel loads of common goods that made you a target for every bandit between here and Kashgar. Number 3 takes us to the fortress passes that were basically the ancient equivalent of international borders with nuclear security. Yumen Pass and Yangguan weren't just checkpoints where some bored guard glanced at your papers. These were massive military installations with garrison troops, beacon towers, and sections of the Han Dynasty Great Wall made from rammed earth so solid that parts of it still exist today. Approaching these passes meant you were leaving Chinese civilization proper and entering the western regions, where Han law became more of a suggestion than a rule, and your survival depended entirely on your preparation and cunning. The passes operated on strict schedules that didn't care about your convenience, with gates opening at dawn and slamming shut at sunset regardless of who was still outside, meaning that arriving even 5 minutes late meant camping outside the walls overnight and hoping bandits didn't know about the wealthy caravans sitting exposed in the darkness. The inspection process could take literally hours as officials went through every single document, opened random cargo bundles looking for contraband salt and iron that could get you imprisoned, and calculated taxes that seemed to change based on how wealthy you looked and how much of a hurry you were in. But these passes also served as critical information hubs where you could learn about conditions ahead, hire additional guards from soldiers finishing their service, buy last-minute supplies at inflated prices, and most importantly, get updates on which routes were safe and which had been hit by raiders recently, making them worth the hassle despite the delays and expenses. Number 2 hits the water crisis that nobody properly appreciates until they're dying of thirst in the desert. Water wasn't just about quantity, though calculating wrong meant dead camels and stranded merchants. It was about quality and politics, and strategy all rolled into one liquid nightmare. Each oasis had water with different mineral contents and contamination levels that locals had adapted to over generations but could destroy travelers' digestive systems leading to dehydration through dysentery even while surrounded by water, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. Experienced merchants played water chess at a grandmaster level, pre-placing sealed ceramic jars at secret locations along familiar routes, negotiating water rights years in advance with oasis rulers, and maintaining detailed mental maps of which wells were seasonal, which were contaminated, and which were controlled by rulers who might suddenly decide that foreign merchants should pay 50 times the local rate. The Han government maintained official water stations along the Hexi corridor, but past the Jade Gate, you entered a world where water access became a weapon that oasis kings wielded more effectively than any sword, with some rulers deliberately poisoning wells to force caravans onto routes where they could be taxed, or creating artificial scarcity to drive up prices during the trading season. And finally, number 1, the absolute worst mistake that killed more merchants than every other danger combined, trying to shortcut through the center of the Taklamakan Desert. The name Taklamakan literally translates to something like place of no return or go in and you won't come out, depending on which etymology you believe. But either way, the meaning was crystal clear to anyone with half a brain. This wasn't just difficult terrain or a challenging crossing. This was 600 miles of shifting sand dunes with no landmarks, no water, no vegetation, no anything except death waiting in various horrible forms. But here's the thing about human nature that the survival guide understood perfectly. Every single generation produced some hotshot merchant who looked at the established routes going around the desert and thought they were smarter than thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. They'd pull out their maps, do some calculations showing how cutting straight across would save 3 weeks of travel, convince themselves that previous attempts failed because those merchants were weak or unprepared, and then they'd load up their camels and march straight into oblivion. Archaeological evidence keeps proving how common this fatal optimism was, with shifting sands occasionally revealing perfectly mummified remains of traders who tried the shortcut, sometimes with their cargo still intact and their faces frozen in expressions that suggest they realized their mistake way too late. The survival guide included specific horror stories meant to scare sense into would-be pioneers, like the merchant Wang who tried to find a central route in 87 BCE with 200 camels and the latest navigation equipment, only to have a single survivor crawl out of the desert weeks later, nearly dead and reporting that they'd lost their bearings after just 2 days when a sandstorm erased all landmarks and that he'd watched the desert literally swallow entire strings of camels during the storm. The message couldn't be clearer. The oases exist at the edges where mountain runoff provides water. The center is death. And anyone who thinks they're the exception is already dead. They just haven't stopped moving yet. These weren't just helpful hints or gentle suggestions from the Han Dynasty survival guide. This was blood-soaked wisdom extracted from centuries of failure and death along the most dangerous trade route in human history. The Silk Road made some people wealthy beyond imagination and created the first true global trade network. But it was built on the bones of merchants who thought they knew better than the guide, who figured they could cut corners or ignore the warnings, who believed that the rules didn't apply to them. The difference between joining the countless skeletons scattered across the desert and returning home rich enough to never leave again came down to following these brutal lessons that previous generations had paid for with their lives. Because on the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty, there were no second chances, only successful traders and cautionary tales.